Welcome. We are embarking on an exploration of one of the most consuming, sensitive, and ultimately catastrophic legal sagas in American history, the McMartin Preschool Trial.
It's a case that, even decades later, is just staggering to look back on.
You've shared a really complex stack of source material, and our goal today is to provide a clear, comprehensive understanding of how this case unfolded, why it became such a flashpoint, and what its final, profound failure revealed.
And when we examine the McMartin case, which began in Manhattan Beach, California in the 1980s, we are looking at a legal phenomenon unlike any other. It's really essential to grasp the sheer scope of it right from the start.
Okay, so let's start there. What was the scale of this?
Well, this was a daycare sexual abuse case that went on for 7 incredibly grueling years. It ran from the initial allegations in 1983 all the way until the final charges were dismissed in 1990.
7 years. That's an immense amount of time for any criminal proceeding.
And 7 years resulted in 0 convictions, not a single one.
Right. And beyond the human cost, which we have to remember was just devastating for everyone involved.
Devastating for the accused, the children, the families, everyone. But the financial statistics, they're also staggering. Our sources confirm this became the longest and most expensive series of criminal trials in American history.
How expensive are we talking about?
It consumed approximately $15 million in public funds.
And that's $15 million in the 1980s and early 90s. That figure is almost unimaginable. What specifically drove that monumental cost?
It was the sheer volume and complexity. You have the defense, the prosecution, the investigation itself. I mean, consider the logistics. 7 primary defendants were charged.
7 people.
Yes. And hundreds of witnesses, multiple teams of defense attorneys, thousands of hours of jury selection and court time spread over 3 years just for the first trial alone.
Wow.
And then you add the cost of transcribing endless court records, the analysis of hundreds of hours of videotaped interviews, security costs, multiple physical excavations of the free school.
Digging for evidence.
Exactly. And the expenses for housing defendants held on extremely high bail. It truly became a bottomless pit of public expenditure, all aimed at a conviction that never happened.
So our goal today is to move beyond the sensational headlines and look analytically at the anatomy of this failure. We want to understand how a few initial complaints could mushroom into this national obsession, with hundreds of alleged victims, only to end with no convictions.
And we'll focus specifically on what the sources reveal about the investigative techniques and the systemic forces that were at play.
Absolutely. And as we navigate this source material, particularly the allegations themselves, we have to maintain an objective tone.
Rooted only in the documented facts and findings. We approach this subject with deep sympathy for everyone involved, but our analysis has to focus on the proven legal and procedural flaws that define this whole moment.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the flashpoint. The single initial report that set this 7-year tragedy in motion back in 1983.
That spark was ignited by a mother named Judy Johnson. She was a parent of a young student at the McMartin Preschool, which was run by Virginia McMartin, and her daughter, Peggy McMartin Bucky.
And what did Johnson report?
She reported to the police that her son had been sodomized by 2 people, her estranged husband and Ray Bucky, who was a teacher at the school, and Virginia McMartin's grandson.
And right away, the source material notes there was immediate controversy about the reliability of this first report.
Precisely. Johnson claimed she started investigating after her son experienced some painful bowel movements. But the sources clearly dispute what happened next.
What's the dispute?
Some accounts suggest that when Johnson prompted her son, asking him if teachers might have molested him, the boy actually denied it.
Okay.
Yet other accounts indicate he confirmed the abuse. So this initial ambiguity, about whether the child's statement was spontaneous or prompted, it's really a precursor to the suggestibility issues that would define the entire investigation.
And Johnson's own statements, which are documented in the sources, they quickly escalated beyond credible, didn't they? They veered into the truly bizarre.
They certainly did. The source material notes she made several fantastical claims to the police. Things like people at the daycare having sexual encounters with animals.
Wow.
The surreal idea that Peggy drilled a child under the arms, and the completely impossible assertion that Ray flew in the air. These kinds of bizarre claims are really important for context.
And why do those outlandish details matter so much?
Because they connect directly to the legal challenge surrounding her credibility. Initially, Ray Bucky was questioned, but he wasn't prosecuted.
Why not?
The police just had no corroborating evidence for Johnson's accusations, which, were already highly dubious. But the seed of suspicion had been planted.
And then the police made a crucial decision that dramatically broadened the investigation. It went from a single questionable complaint to a community-wide crisis. They sent out a form letter.
That's right. The police department sent a form letter dated September 8th, 1983, to approximately 200 parents of current and former students.
200 families.
Yes. And this letter is arguably the single most critical factor in transforming a weak allegation into a mass hysteria. It essentially instructed hundreds of parents to become amateur interrogators of their own children.
Let's analyze the phrasing of that letter because the contents are just jarring. It's highly inflammatory, suggesting widespread, specific abuse.
The letter confirmed that a criminal investigation into child molestation was underway and that Ray Buckey had been arrested. It then asked for parental assistance. It said, quote, "Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or if he or she has been a victim."
So it's an institutional mandate for suspicion?
Exactly. And it didn't stop at general inquiries. It explicitly detailed severe criminal acts, providing a script for parents to follow when questioning their young children.
What kind of acts did it list?
It listed things like oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttock or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of taking the child's temperature. It also mentioned unauthorized photography of children without clothing.
Just receiving a letter like that from the police? It would immediately place any parent on edge, fearing their child had been harmed. The psychological impact is hard to overstate.
It created a feedback loop of fear.
Yeah.
But we also have to note the contradictory message that was embedded in the letter, which it seems few in the community heeded at the time.
What was that?
The letter explicitly stated that the department had discovered, and this is a quote, "no detrimental information concerning the operation of the school." And it confirmed that no other employee in the school is under investigation at that point.
So the police were saying, we only have evidence against one person, but also, please assume the worst possible crimes have happened and question your children extensively.
It's the definition of institutionalized mixed messaging. It showed this tension between the legal mandate, they'd arrested one person, and the societal pressure to show proactive concern to the community. By sending that letter, they basically ensured the investigation would dramatically broaden, regardless of the quality of the evidence they had.
We absolutely have to return to Judy Johnson's background because her mental health status was a key point for the defense, and it exposed major issues later on.
The source material is unequivocal here. Johnson was diagnosed with, and had been hospitalized for, acute paranoid schizophrenia.
And that diagnosis is critical, isn't it? Because paranoid schizophrenia can involve severe disturbances in thinking.
Exactly. It can lead to delusions, paranoia, and the creation of detailed, often bizarre, narratives that the individual genuinely believes are true.
So if you connect those clinical details back to her initial claims, the flying teacher, the animals, it lends a specific clinical explanation for why her claims escalated so quickly into the impossible.
It frames her initial report not as an isolated incident, but as a potential byproduct of a severe mental health crisis. And tragically, Judy Johnson died in 1986 from complications related to chronic alcoholism before the preliminary hearing had even concluded.
And even after her death, her medical history remained a source of legal contention, right? The prosecution and defense had very different timelines for her mental health.
They did. The prosecution claimed that her mental illness was caused by the stress of the trial and the alleged events. However, the sources note that Johnson had admitted to the prosecution before the investigation even began that she was mentally ill.
And that prior admission became a key piece of information.
It was a key piece of exonerating information that was later withheld from the defense for years, which really underscores the legal misconduct that was involved in pursuing the case.
So that context is crucial. But the police letter had already done its work. The number of alleged victims just exploded almost immediately.
It did. The next phase involved the Children's Institute International, or CII, which was an abuse therapy clinic in Los Angeles, led by a social worker named Key McFarlane. Hundreds of children were funneled through the CII for interviews.
And by the spring of 1984, the sheer volume of claims had reached a staggering, frankly alarming number.
Yes, 360 children were now alleged to have been victims or witnesses.
360.
And this point marks the transition from, an individual police investigation to a full-blown institutional response, one that quickly became contaminated by highly questionable techniques. This is where the foundation of the case really began to crack, long before a jury was ever seated.
We need to spend some real time on these interviewing techniques. They were the primary target of the defense and the focus of a lot of later psychological research. What did the defense allege was happening in those interviews?
The defense argued that the methods were highly suggestive. They claimed the interviewers weren't eliciting truthful statements or spontaneous recall.
But were instead doing what?
Instead, they were inviting children to pretend or speculate about supposed events. They were essentially planting ideas that the children then adopted as memories.
And this wasn't just a legal tactic. Later academic research, psychological studies into child memory and suggestibility actually validated these concerns.
Yes, it confirmed that the methods used on the McMartin children were extremely suggestive and led directly to false accusations. These methods introduced severe risks associated with what we now call false memory syndrome.
Which is the creation of detailed, often traumatic memories of events that never actually happen.
Right, generated primarily through prolonged and biased external suggestion. The core issue was the investigative environment. Children, especially preschoolers, are eager to please adults, and they're highly susceptible to repeated questioning that implies a specific answer is wanted.
And the review conducted by the clinical psychologist Michael P. Maloney, he was a key expert witness. He provided the clearest critique of the CII process based on the prosecution's own evidence, the video recordings.
Maloney's testimony was absolutely devastating for the prosecution. He reviewed the videotapes, and he characterized the techniques as improper, coercive, directive, problematic, and adult-directed. He argued they forced the children to follow a rigid script laid out by the interviewer.
His conclusion was that many of the kids' statements in the interviews were generated by the examiner.
That's exactly right. This suggests the statements weren't reflections of memory, but conversational output designed to satisfy the adult interviewer.
And the visual evidence backed that up.
Completely. The transcripts and recordings contained this vast disparity. Far more speech came from the adults than from the children. The video showed a pattern of resistance from the children to the interviewer's attempts to get disclosures.
So the children were actually pushing back.
They were. They were often denying, confusing, or contradicting the interviewers, only to be redirected and pressed until they finally offered some kind of affirmation.
It's so significant that these video recordings, which were intended to be the prosecution's strongest evidence, ended up being the defense's most powerful tool.
They absolutely were. The tapes functioned as a meta-critique of the entire investigation. They showed the jury, in real time, the techniques of coercion. They showed how a child could be led to provide vivid, dramatic testimony about events they had not experienced.
And this proved that the techniques being used were against established state guidelines.
It did. They were contrary to the existing California guidelines for child witness investigations.
And what about objective physical evidence? The prosecution's case seems to weaken even further there.
It does. A doctor, Astrid Heppenstall-Heger, performed physical exams and claimed to photograph minute scarring, which she suggested was caused by anal penetration.
But how rigorous were those findings?
They were highly contested.
Yeah.
A journalist, John Earle, later pointed out that these findings were often based less on definitive physical proof and more on unsubstantiated medical histories provided by the parents.
The same parents who received the suggestive letter.
Exactly. So the physical evidence, just like the testimonial evidence, was inextricably linked to the flawed initial process.
And you see this in the dramatic shrinking of the victim pool.
It's the most telling statistic about the structural integrity of the case. They started with 360 alleged victims. Only 41 children testified in the grand jury and pretrial hearings. By the time the case reached the actual trial,
How many?
fewer than a dozen children testified.
That reduction from 360 to fewer than 12 testifying witnesses, it speaks volumes about the inability of the prosecution to sustain the initial mass panic under real legal scrutiny.
It illustrates that the initial 360 claims were likely generated by the process itself, not spontaneous, truthful disclosures. As the legal system applied pressure, the unreliable claims were winnowed away.
As the case proceeded, the allegations also became linked with broader cultural anxieties of the 1980s, specifically the emerging panic over satanic ritual abuse.
That cultural context is essential. The specific, unusual nature of the McMartin allegations mirrored and reinforced this narrative of organized, secretive, often ritualistic abuse that was gaining traction nationally.
Can you give some more detail on the specific, bizarre nature of the allegations that fueled this panic?
The claims included children describing seeing witches fly, being transported in a hot air balloon, and accessing secret subterranean tunnels. These fantastical elements are a hallmark of induced testimony during that whole Satanic Panic era.
And we have to mention the specific anecdote that completely undermined the credibility of the identification process.
The one involving the celebrity, yes. When the defense lawyer, Danny Davis, presented one child with a series of photo lineups, the child identified the famous action star Chuck Norris as one of the abusers.
Chuck Norris.
Yes. And this provided a chilling and stark example for the defense. It showed that the children were identifying individuals based on suggestion or speculation, not genuine memory.
And there were other claims just as outlandish. Orgies at car washes and airports.
Right. And the terrifying notion of children being flushed down toilets into secret rooms for abuse, then somehow cleaned up and returned without parents noticing. These claims defied physical and logical reality.
But the most dramatic and central allegation was the existence of secret tunnels beneath the school. That became a huge focus.
It did. The perfect setting for ritualistic hidden crimes.
So what did the physical investigations into these alleged tunnels find?
The initial searches found nothing. Multiple excavations were performed, and they only found old buildings and debris from the period before the school was constructed in 1966. No evidence of any secret chambers or tunnels.
But the controversy persisted. Parents who believed the children hired an archaeologist in 1990.
That was E. Gary Stickle. Using ground-penetrating radar, he claimed he found anomalies evidence consistent with tunnels. This gave the tunnel narrative a brief resurgence of scientific legitimacy in the media.
But there was counter-evidence that addressed his findings.
Meticulous and essentially definitive counter-evidence. John Earle, in his 1995 analysis, pointed out a critical detail. The school stood on a concrete slab floor that was largely undisturbed, and his inspection of the soil revealed that the disturbed areas were consistent with the installation of the sewer line and general construction fill that was buried under the slab before the school was built. Some of it dated back to the 1930s.
And another report in 2002 offered a very clear, mundane explanation.
W. Joseph Wyatt's report, yes. He concluded the anomalies were almost certainly a series of adjacent rubbish pits used by previous property owners before the preschool was even built. The debris included things like old bottles from the 30s and 40s, tin cans, animal bones.
So the secret tunnels, a defining visual of the panic, were just old trash pits.
It's a profound demonstration of the power of suggestion overriding reality, which brings us to the naked movie star game allegation.
Right. This was presented as evidence of forced nude photography. What was revealed about that during the trial?
The children themselves, under careful questioning, clarified that naked movie star was actually just a common playground taunt. It was a rhyming phrase used to tease others. What you say is what you are. You're a naked movie star.
It had nothing to do with taking pictures.
Nothing at all. It was a complete misinterpretation, or perhaps a coercive misdirection of an innocent children's rhyme.
So after all of this, the panic, the questionable interviews, the lack of evidence, the case finally moved into the courtroom.
And the legal proceedings were protracted beyond comprehension. The initial charges were filed on March 2010, 1984, against Virginia McMartin, her daughter Peggy McMartin Buckey, her grandchildren Ray and Peggy Ann Buckey, and 3 teachers.
And the initial 115 counts quickly spiraled to a massive 321 counts involving 48 children.
This strategy was evident in the preliminary hearing, which itself lasted an extraordinary 20 months. And during that time, the children's testimony proved inconsistent and contradictory.
And we see the broader cultural panic infiltrating the process at this early stage as well.
We do. The sources note the presence of Michelle Smith and Lawrence Pastor, the co-authors of the infamous book Michelle Remembers, which falsely popularized the concept of recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse.
They were meeting with the families.
They met with parents and children, which one prosecutor, Glenn Stevens, later claimed was highly influential in shaping and distorting the children's testimonies toward those cult-like narratives.
The case finally saw a major reduction in 1986, which really confirms how weak the evidence was.
Yes, the district attorney, Ira Reiner, reviewed the file and, to his credit, stated that the evidence against most of the defendants was incredibly weak. He dropped all charges against Virginia McMartin, Peggy Ann Buckey, and the 3 teachers.
But Peggy McMartin Buckey and Ray Buckey remain in custody. What was their situation regarding bail?
The constraints were severe. Peggy McMartin Buckey's bail was set at $1 million. Ray Buckey was denied bail initially. So even though most of the charges were dropped against 5 co-defendants, these 2 remained behind bars.
The first trial finally opened in July 1987 and ran for 3 agonizing years. And there was a glaring procedural imbalance that occurred during this time with the medical witnesses.
This was a critical failure of fairness. The prosecution called 7 different medical witnesses to try and support their theory of physical abuse.
7 experts.
Yes. In contrast, the defense, trying to rebut those 7, was limited by the judge to only 1 rebuttal witness.
Just 1. Why?
Ostensibly, in the interest of saving court time. But that immediately skewed the perception of evidence for the jury, and the prosecution capitalized on it.
How so?
In their summation, they used this numerical disparity as an explicit argument, suggesting that since they presented 7 experts and the defense only 1, the weight of scientific evidence must favor conviction.
And while all this was unfolding, Ray Buckey spent years incarcerated.
She spent nearly 5 years in jail. After being denied bail, it was finally granted, but set at an unobtainable $3 million. That was later cut to $1.5 million, but he could only raise the funds for his release in February 1989.
5 years of his life lost.
On charges that ultimately resulted in acquittals.
We should also look at the vindication of Peggy Ann Buckey, whose charges were dropped earlier regarding her professional credentials.
In 1989, she successfully appealed to have her teaching credentials restored, and the judge, in that specific ruling, was highly critical of the prosecution's evidence.
What did the judge say?
He found no credible evidence or corroboration to support the suspension. And furthermore, the judge explicitly reviewed the CII videotaped interviews and concluded they revealed a pronounced absence of any evidence implicating Peggy Ann.
Which cast doubt on the interviewing techniques themselves.
It was a massive judicial confirmation that the investigation at the heart of the entire case was fundamentally flawed.
And the prosecution faced an even more damning blow regarding the integrity of their own witnesses with the jailhouse informant, George Freeman.
The use of jailhouse informants is always legally fraught, but this was a spectacular abuse. In October 1987, George Freeman testified that Ray Buckey confessed the crimes to him in their shared cell.
A confession. That's powerful evidence.
Except Freeman's reliability was non-existent. He was later exposed as a serial perjurer. He tried to flee the country and eventually confessed to manufacturing testimony in a series of other criminal cases in exchange for preferential treatment.
And what was the deal the McMartin prosecution offered him?
To secure his testimony against Buckey, Freeman was granted immunity from previous perjury charges. The prosecution actively guaranteed the freedom of a known, admitted liar to obtain a confession that couldn't be corroborated.
It's a fundamental corruption of the process.
Absolutely.
So after 3 years of trial, the jury finally delivered its verdict in January 1990.
Peggy McMartin Buckey was acquitted on all counts. Ray Buckey was cleared on 52 of 65 counts.
And the analysis of the jury's decision offers a profound insight into the failure of the case. What did the jurors say?
9 of the 11 jurors explained a strange paradox. They believed the children had been molested, meaning they bought into the idea that abuse likely occurred at the school, but they could not determine who committed the abuse beyond a reasonable doubt.
How do we reconcile that? A belief that abuse happened, but a complete inability to attribute it to the named defendants.
It points directly back to the investigative failure. The suggestive interviews successfully created a narrative of victimization in the jury's mind. They felt empathy.
But the evidence wasn't there.
The evidence tying that story to Ray or Peggy McMartin Buckey was so convoluted, contradictory, and tainted by coaching and withheld evidence that it simply couldn't satisfy the criminal standard of proof.
And what about the remaining 13 counts against Ray Buckey?
That resulted in a hung jury. 11 of the jurors voted to acquit, but 2 refused, resulting in a deadlock.
Which meant a retrial.
Yes. Ray Buckey, having just been cleared on 52 counts, faced a second trial on 6 of those remaining counts, starting in May 1990.
And the result?
Another hung jury in July 1990. At that point, after 7 years, the district attorney finally gave up. All charges against Ray Buckey were dismissed. He had spent 5 years incarcerated without a single conviction to justify it.
The lack of conviction, despite the massive effort and expense, exposed systemic failings that went far beyond just the interviewing room. Let's detail the clear acts of prosecutorial misconduct.
The sources reveal shocking behavior from the DA's office. Glenn Stevens, one of the original prosecutors, left the case in protest, stating unequivocally that evidence had been withheld from the defense.
What specifically was being hidden from the Buckey's defense team?
Stevens cited evidence that Johnson's son, the initial accuser, did not actually identify Ray Buckey in a series of photographs during the initial investigation. This was directly contradictory to the prosecution's central narrative.
So they buried that.
Stevens accused Deputy District Attorney Robert Philibosian of outright lying and withholding this exonerating evidence to keep the Buckies jailed.
And we come back to Judy Johnson's mental health records. How were those manipulated?
The evidence that Johnson suffered from acute paranoid schizophrenia and had admitted to being mentally ill before the investigation, that was withheld for the defense for 3 years.
3 years.
And when it was finally provided, it was delivered in sanitized reports, specifically excluding her own statements about her mental state. This deliberate withholding and alteration of key evidence is a grave breach of legal ethics.
And beyond the courtroom, the media coverage was critically flawed, contributing significantly to the public hysteria.
Oh, the media coverage was generally skewed. News outlets often gave uncritical acceptance to the prosecution's theories and the children's sensationalized allegations. This transformed the case into an unchallenged national cause célèbre.
And the lack of journalistic independence was stunningly compromised by 2 specific conflicts of interest.
The first, and maybe the most scandalous, involved Wayne Satz, a reporter for KABC who became romantically involved with Key McFarlane.
The social worker who ran the CII and conducted the interviews?
Exactly. He was reporting extensively on her work and the children's claims while being romantically involved with the primary source and architect of the investigation.
It's a profound ethical violation. What was the second conflict?
The second involved the Los Angeles Times. The editor overseeing the paper's coverage of the trial, David Rosenzweig, became engaged to marry the prosecutor, Lael Rubin.
So the reporter is with the investigator, and the editor is marrying the prosecutor.
It shows how intertwined the legal system and the press became, creating an environment that was utterly hostile to the defense and to objective reporting.
This media frenzy undoubtedly contributed to the pressure on the jury. But this leads us to the most powerful and final piece of evidence about the investigative failure: the adult retraction.
Yes. In 2005, one of the original child accusers, now an adult, completely and publicly retracted the allegations. This statement is incredibly valuable because it's a candid, first-hand account of the psychological damage caused not by the accused, but by the investigation itself.
What were the key phrases the adult accuser used to explain why they fabricated the testimony?
They stated, quote, "Never did anyone do anything to me, and I never saw them doing anything. I said a lot of things that didn't happen. I lied."
That is a direct, painful confirmation of Michael Maloney's earlier expert testimony about suggestibility.
It's the human proof of the psychological science. The accuser explained the exact mechanism of coercion. Anytime I would give them an answer that they didn't like, they would ask again and encourage me to give them the answer they were looking for.
So the interviews weren't searches for truth. They were interrogations designed to confirm a pre-existing hypothesis.
Exactly. The accuser admitted feeling intense pressure to cooperate with what their parents, the interviewers, wanted them to say.
The McMartin case created a seismic shift in how the U.S. legal system handled child witnesses. What were the most significant lasting impacts?
On the legislative side, the case directly influenced laws intended to protect child witnesses from trauma. Many states passed laws, which the Supreme Court upheld in Maryland v. Craig, allowing children to testify via closed-circuit television.
But there was an alarming and paradoxical negative reaction to the evidentiary value of the recorded interviews.
This is perhaps the most concerning legacy. Because the video recordings were so effective for the defense by clearly showing coercion to the jury, some prosecutors and investigators responded not by improving their techniques,
But by what?
by abandoning their tape recorders and notepads.
Think about that for a moment. Instead of fixing the flawed technique, the response was to eliminate the evidence of the recording itself.
Precisely. The source material notes that a manual was subsequently produced for child abuse investigators that actually urged them not to record interviews. This procedural change effectively eliminated a critical layer of accountability.
So it was a reaction designed to protect the prosecution's narrative rather than the integrity of the evidence.
That's right. And beyond legal procedures, the financial and institutional consequences were immense, particularly for research into child sexual abuse.
The timing is undeniable, isn't it?
The media attention led to a gigantic surge in funding. The budget for the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect went from about $1.8 million in 1983 to a peak of $15 million by 1985.
And because this surge happened at the height of the panic, some of that federal funding ended up supporting narratives that were later discredited by the McMartin outcome.
Correct. Federal money was used to sponsor conferences focused specifically on ritual abuse, which lent an undeserved aura of official respectability to the Satanic Panic theories. And it supported books like Behind the Playground Walls, which used a sample of McMartin children and portrayed them all as actual victims, completely ignoring the lack of convictions.
It shows the institutional momentum of the panic continued, fueled by public money, even as the criminal case was collapsing.
The momentum was almost unstoppable once the money and the media narrative aligned. It took a rigorous, albeit slow and agonizing, legal process to finally stop it.
As we synthesize everything we've explored, the McMartin trial really stands as a critical case study in American justice.
It was a catastrophic 7-year legal failure, characterized by a fundamental breakdown in due process. It began with deeply flawed allegations from a source battling mental illness, was amplified by a media frenzy and cultural anxiety, and was ultimately dismantled by irrefutable video evidence showing coercive interviewing techniques.
The consequence was $15 million in public spending, 5 years of wrongful incarceration for Ray Buckey, and 0 convictions.
It's a profound, sobering narrative that demonstrates how quickly institutional momentum, bias, and public fear can erode the meticulous standards required by the justice system.
And that leads us to the final thought we want to leave with you. The McMartin case highlights a core challenge that remains central to our justice system today.
When confronting sensitive cases involving children, the necessary pursuit of justice and protection must be meticulously balanced with an absolutely rigorous standard of evidence and unbiased investigation. The outcome of the McMartin trial, that failure to convict, was a direct consequence of overriding due process in the face of immense emotional and institutional pressure.
We encourage you to consider the lasting ethical implications of allowing fear, or the intense desire for a quick, morally satisfying answer, to override critical thinking and rigorous evidential standards. This case serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the damage done when institutional momentum takes precedence over fact.
Thank you for sharing this exploration with us.
Thanks for listening.